Alexandra of Denmark was born on the 1st of December 1844 in the Yellow Palace in Copenhagen, Denmark. Her parents were Christian IX of Denmark and Louise of Hesse-Kassel. She had 5 siblings: Frederick, George, Dagmar, Tura, and Valdemar. Growing up, she lived a very modest life, and her father did not have a large income. In 1848, Christian VIII of Denmark died, and his only son Frederick ascended the throne. Frederick had no children from 2 failed marriages, and a succession crisis arose. Frederick ruled in both Denmark and Schleswig-Holstein, where there were 2 forms of succession. In Denmark, both men and women could inherit, although male preference primogeniture was in place. However, in Schleswig-Holstein, only men could inherit. In 1852, it was decided that Alexandra's father would be the heir. Alexandra and her family moved into Bernstorff Palace, and although their status had risen, they received no increase in their income. By the late 1850s, Queen Victoria of the United Kingdom and her husband Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha were searching for a wife for their eldest son and heir, Albert Edward, Prince of Wales. Their eldest daughter, Crown Princess Victoria of Prussia, was enlisted by her parents in seeking a suitable candidate. Alexandra was not their first choice, as the Danes were at conflict with the Prussians over the territory of Schleswig-Holstein. However, eventually Alexandra was chosen as the only suitable candidate for their son. In 1861, Alexandra met Albert after Crown Princess Victoria introduced the two to each other. A year later, Albert proposed to Alexandra and she accepted. Though they had only met a few times and didn't really know each other, they were wed on the 10th of March 1863 in St. George's Chapel. The English court was still in mourning for Albert's father, who had died in December 1861. So ladies were restricted to wearing grey, lilac and mauve, and only Alexandra's closest relations were invited to the wedding, which upset many of her Danish relatives, who were not invited. After her wedding, Alexandra went by the title of the Princess of Wales. By 1864, Alexandra's father was King of Denmark, her brother George was King of the Hellenes, her sister Dagmar was engaged to the Tsarevich of Russia, and Alexandra had given birth to her first child, Albert Victor, although he was more affectionately known as Eddie by the family. Alexandra and Albert would go on to have 5 more children: George, Louise, Victoria, Maud, and Alexander John. According to Queen Victoria's diaries, all of the children were born prematurely. However, it is more likely that Alexandra misled Queen Victoria on the delivery dates, so that the Queen would not be present during the births of her children. During the birth of Louise, Alexandra contracted rheumatic fever, which threatened her life. Though she recovered, she was left with a permanent limp. The German invasion of Schleswig-Holstein had a profound effect on Alexandra, who grew to greatly dislike Germany. She and her husband supported Denmark during the war, which was a point of contention for her mother-in-law, Queen Victoria, and her sister-in-law, Crown Princess Victoria. Alexandra was popular amongst the English. She appeared dignified, charming, and affectionate. She greatly enjoyed dancing, ice skating, and hunting, much to her mother-in-law's dismay. With her husband, Alexandra went on many international tours, such as tours to Ireland, Austria, Egypt, and Greece. The Prince and Princess of Wales set up residence in Sandringham House and Marlborough House. Their marriage was mostly happy, although Albert didn't give his wife as much love and affection as she would have liked. They became closer when Albert almost died from typhoid fever in 1671, and their youngest son, Alexander John, died. Alexandra and Albert wanted privacy when their youngest son died, but Queen Victoria insisted on a period of court mourning and a funeral for the infant, which the press saw as a sickening mummery. Alexandra mostly looked the other way as her husband had liaisons with other women and was perpetually unfaithful to her. Throughout her life, Alexandra suffered from several physical disabilities. She suffered from progressive deafness, otosclerosis, and a limp. When the ladies of her court and society at large saw that Alexandra had a limp, they adopted a similar limp in it as fashionable. 3 years in the late 1870s, Alexandra remained separated from her 2 sons as her sons went on a worldwide cruise as part of their naval and general education. Alexandra showed herself to be an affectionate and loving mother who wrote regularly to them. In 1881, Alexandra and Albert Edward travelled to Russia to represent Britain at the funeral of Alexander II of Russia, and to comfort Alexandra's sister Dagmar, who became the Tsarina. Alexandra undertook many public duties for the Queen and became the public face of the monarchy along with her husband. In 1892, her eldest son, Eddie, Duke of Clarence and Avondale, died after contracting influenza. Alexandra fell into a deep mourning and had his room and possessions kept exactly as he had left them, similar to how Queen Victoria had reacted after her husband Prince Albert's death in 1861. Queen Victoria passed away in 1901, and Albert Edward and Alexandra became the King and Queen of the United Kingdom. That same year, Alexandra and her husband cared for their grandchildren, while her son George and his wife Mary went on an extensive tour of the British Empire. Days before the scheduled coronation, in June 1902, Albert Edward, now Edward VII, fell ill with appendicitis. The coronation was postponed so Edward VII could recover from his surgery. Alexandra stood in for the king during a military parade and the Royal Ascot races to avoid public alarm. In August 1902, the coronation was held and Alexandra and Edward were crowned together. Alexandra's duties changed little, and she kept on the same servants when she became queen. In December 1903, Alexandra's woman of the bedchamber, Charlotte Knollys, saved the Queen's life after her room began to fill with smoke. She roused Alexandra and brought her to safety. After Alexandra's father died, Alexandra and her sister Dagmar bought a villa in Denmark in order to retain their family links. They used it as a private getaway. Alexandra was denied access to her husband's papers and was excluded from some foreign tours and politics. In 1910, Alexandra attended a debate at the British House of Commons, becoming the first Queen Consort to visit the House of Commons. During a visit to her brother George I of Greece, her husband fell ill. Alexandra arrived back in England only the day before her husband died. On his deathbed, she nursed him and allowed his mistress Alice Keppel to visit. Albert died on the 6th of May 1910. Alexandra refused to allow his body to be moved, and only after over a week did she agree to have his body moved. She moved out of Buckingham Palace to Marlborough House and retained Sandringham House until her death. Alexandra did not attend her son's coronation in 1911, which was customary. It was normal for a crowned queen not to attend the coronation of another king or queen. She continued to work for the monarchy. In 1918, her grandnephew Tsar Nicholas II and his family were assassinated, and she had her sister Dagmar rescued from Russia in 1919. Dagmar and Alexandra spent some time together. Throughout her senior years, Alexandra remained youthful in her appearance, but eventually the years caught up to her. From 1920, she suffered from partial blindness accompanied by profound deafness. Alexandra passed away on the 20th of November 1925 from a heart attack. She lay in state at Westminster Abbey before being buried beside her husband in St. George's Chapel in Windsor Castle. Mary of Teck was born on the 26th of May 1867 in Kensington Palace. She was the only daughter of Prince Francis, Duke of Teck, and Princess Mary Adelaide of Cambridge, a granddaughter of George III of the United Kingdom. Mary was born in the same room as her cousin Queen Victoria had been over 48 years earlier. Her parents named her after Queen Victoria, with Mary's first name actually being Victoria. Mary was the eldest of 4 children and had a happy but strict upbringing. She learned to be discreet, firm, and tactful in order to resolve her 3 brothers' arguments. The children played with the children of the Prince of Wales, who were close in age to them. Mary and her family lived in Kensington Palace and White Lodge, granted to them by the Queen. While her brothers were educated at boarding school, Mary was educated by her mother and governess at home. Her parents were not wealthy and often lived abroad with a small staff to economize. Mary grew to be fluent in English, German, and French. In 1885, Mary and her family returned to London. By this time, Mary had become her mother's unofficial secretary and helped her mother to organize parties. In 1886, Mary debuted in society, and being the only unmarried British princess who was not a descendant of Queen Victoria, made her a desirable candidate for Prince Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence and Avondale, the eldest son of the Prince of Wales. In 1891, Albert proposed to Mary and she accepted. Unfortunately, Albert Victor died only weeks later of pneumonia. Albert's brother George, Duke of York, became close to Mary and proposed to her in 1893. That same year, in July, the couple were wed. They were deeply in love with each other and were never unfaithful. They had 6 children together: Edward, Albert, Mary, Henry, George, and John. The couple lived in York Cottage and in St. James's Palace. They led a simple, quiet life. Their children were cared for by a nanny, which was normal for upper-class families. However, the nannies they hired ended up abusing the children and were promptly fired. Eventually, the affectionate and much-loved Charlotte Bell was hired as the children's nanny. Mary and George were quite distant and cold towards their children, but they did love them very dearly. As Duke and Duchess of York, the couple carried out a variety of public duties in support of the Queen. On the 22nd of January 1901, Queen Victoria died, and Mary's father-in-law ascended the throne as Edward VII. For the rest of 1901, George and Mary toured the British Empire, something no royal had ever done before. The King and Queen took care of their children while they were away. In November, George was created Prince of Wales with Mary as Princess of Wales. They moved into Marlborough House. On the 6th of May 1910, Edward VII died and George became George V, with Mary as his Queen Consort. Mary decided to drop her first name and became known as Queen Mary. She was the first British Queen Consort to be born in Britain since Catherine Parr. On the 22nd of June 1911, the King and Queen were crowned together in Westminster Abbey, and on the 12th of December 1911, they were crowned Emperor and Empress at the Delhi Durbar in India. While Mary and her mother-in-law Queen Alexandra were on friendly terms, Alexandra was stubborn and demanded that she take precedence over Mary at the funeral of Edward VII. She also kept some of the royal jewels, which should have passed on to Mary as the new queen. During the First World War, Mary instituted austerity measures at the palace. Food was rationed and she visited wounded and dying servicemen in hospitals. In 1917, the royal house's surname was changed to the English-sounding Windsor, as anti-German feeling ran high in Britain. 2 months after the war, Queen Mary's youngest child, John, died at the age of 13. His death caused immense shock and sorrow for his parents. The couple became closer, and Mary continued to be of great support for her husband in the later half of his reign. She offered him much advice and was a calming presence for the king. From the late 1920s, George fell ill numerous times with lung problems. Mary nursed him when he was sick. In 1935, George V celebrated his Silver Jubilee, and paid tribute to his wife in his speech. On the 20th of January 1936, George V died. Their eldest son Edward ascended the throne as Edward VIII. Mary was then known as just Queen Mary. By the end of the year, Edward had abdicated, and Mary's second son, Albert, had ascended the throne as George VI. Mary was supportive of her son, Edward, but could not understand why he would neglect his duties and abdicate. Mary took a keen interest in the upbringing of her granddaughters, Elizabeth and Margaret, the only children of George VI. She took them on excursions in London to art galleries and museums to compensate for their lack of an educational regime. During the Second World War, George VI wanted his mother to evacuate from London, and while she was hesitant to do so, she decided to live at Badminton House in Gloucestershire, the home of her niece, the Duchess of Beaufort. During the war, she visited troops and factories and directed the gathering of scrap materials. After the war, in June 1945, Mary returned to Marlborough House. Mary was an eager collector of objects and photos that had a royal connection. Most of the time, she obtained the objects by paying for them. On other occasions, she would express a desire for someone's possession and expect that that person would give it to her. In February 1952, the king died. By this point, half of her children were dead, with her son George having died in 1942 during an air crash. Her eldest granddaughter, Princess Elizabeth, Duchess of Edinburgh, ascended the throne as Queen Elizabeth II. Little over a year later, Mary died on the 24th of March 1953 in her sleep. Before her death, she had let it be known that the coronation should not be postponed should she die beforehand. Her body lay in state at Westminster Hall before she was buried beside her husband at St. George's Chapel, Windsor Castle.